The next project's called Voltaire. When all of you were young children, you probably remember being told that no two snowflakes are alike, and that's true, and I'll get into that in a second. I like to think of Voltaire as a time machine where the ice that is cloned, I don't think it's common to think about ice being cloned, but ice being cloned is not thousands of years old, but it's more remarkably thousands of years ago. So I'm cloning glaciers from the last glacial maximum that covered the northern hemisphere 20,000 years ago. I was invited by the European Union for a project called Emergencies, which means emergencies, right? Everything, emergencies with our body, with our planet, with the atmosphere, with our economies, with our money, you name it. And so in Voltaire, I clone ancient ice core samples to replicate moments in time. But to kind of get there intellectually, we have to stop and think, if no two snowflakes are alike, how can you actually reproduce something that can't be reproducible? Well, in nature, when a snowflake falls, let's say Stan and I and John and Peter are falling next to each other, in the Appalachian Mountains. And when we fall, we record atomically the history of our fall. We may be similar, but we're not identical. However, in a laboratory, you can reproduce them like over and over and over. But we're not talking about reproducing snowflakes. We're talking about cloning glaciers. So if you take water and you run it through a millipore process and a bunch of other processes, you can actually remove all the contaminants to where it can't remember how to freeze. It doesn't know how to do that until minus 41 degrees Celsius. And when it does, it homogeneously freezes, nucleates, and it doesn't look like ice that typically any of us have ever seen. So snowflakes are these unique atomic recordings in their lifetimes. But if you take ultra pure water and you dope it, that means introduce a material to it that has high epitaxy, that means a similar atomic structure, it will force that ultra cold water to freeze and actually mimic the blueprint of the doping sample quite accurately. So what I've done here is this doesn't look like any probably ice cube in your refrigerator at home. Very, very different. The atomic lattice between the ice core sample and the ultra cold, ultra pure water, when they match, they actually stretch. Imagine that if Stan and I were in Tyvek suits, class 4 Tyvek suits, and we were in a swimming pool area that had been completely cleaned, and the water in the swimming pool was ultra cold and ultra pure, and Stan walked out over the diving board and dangled a snowflake off the edge, and he dropped it in. What do you think would happen in that water? It's ultra cold, it's wanting to freeze, it wants to go through a phase change. It'll basically take that tiny little piece of the snowflake and freeze instantly, not through heat dissipation. You'll actually hear a giant pop. And so in the project for Voltaire, which was done in Guimarães, Portugal, for the capital of culture, in a huge old facility, ice core samples taken from about a mile deep in Greenland were shipped in to a huge laboratory that's extremely cold, and I build a system that here are the ice core samples coming in. They're packed in ice, dry ice, and I'm letting the lattice relax just a little tiny bit. But I built a very special freezer inside of the museum that has ultra cold light panels in the back. It has anti-cavitating fans and circuitry that allow for the air to circulate quite properly so that it's extremely cold, very even. They can't be contaminated. The water that's being placed inside of the vessels that I'll freeze the crystals are sealed the same way that like a ringer in the hospital would be a bag of fluid, and you have to actually use a small cannula to introduce these chip samples to do the triggering of the freezing. It's very, very cold. This used to be the chiller for the largest fabric manufacturer in Europe. They made all of the military uniforms for NATO. And on the left-hand side, you can see sort of the turbine fins, and on the right-hand side, you can see the exhaust, and inside you can see the freezer that's built. And this is what the ice crystals look like. They freeze instantaneously. They have boundary migration over time if you did time-lapse photography, so they're not stable. They're constantly sort of battling and warring and changing. But the idea is, in this photograph, You'll actually see in the lower left-hand image a camera, because human eyes see based on horizontal parallax. When we're looking at monocularly through a camera on the internet, for example, we only see one view, so we don't really see them as three-dimensional and almost holographic-like. So each of the crystals actually move ever so subtly so that the camera can pick up the shapes and the distortions in them. So what you basically have are ice core samples and moments of time, right, that are taken from 20,000 years ago, placed inside of ultra pure water, water that wants to go from a liquid to a solid through a phase change, but it doesn't know how, and it uses it as a blueprint to actually copy that moment in time. So this is what it looks like. This is a pretty good, video of it. The size maybe on your laptop, about 16 inches wide is about right. They're stunningly beautiful to look at, but at the same time, when you realize that it's not 20,000 years old, but 20,000 years ago, it's like a time machine. It's like time travel. And in this particular case, if you wanted to do the science, you could actually determine the wavelength that you're looking at. Quantum electrodynamics would actually allow you to kind of determine the amount of stress on the atomic lattice based on the wavelength of light. There's a lot of science that we could do behind it. But I just want to kind of keep moving through the project. The wind is so strong that the couples have to brace themselves when they're inside. The next project that I want to share with you is called Altamira. And I often like to remind people that philosophically, where I come from as an artist, I'd like to think of the fact that we're not just 100-year biological vessels that sort of expire with cell death, but we're million-year creatures embedded in a billion-year process. And if we were going to reimagine what it meant to be an artist thinking about making work for who we were, who we are, and who we will become, places like museums and galleries are highly challenged simply because they don't really encapsulate the kind of timescales and the frames of references that I'm including in my creative practice. So what would a work of art look like that talk to who we were, who we are, and who we will become? So in Altamira, how many of you remember, maybe even you just did it today, when you were a kid, you'd press your hands on your eyes? If you press long enough, you actually start to see beautiful patterns of light, right? Well, those are, sodium and potassium ions sort of stimulating ganglion nerves, and the brain tries to interpret it as light. We've actually known this for a long time. It's been written about. One of the most interesting things that happened was sort of during the era of Benjamin Franklin. They would actually have phosphine parties. This is a phosphine party. This is an 19th century, 18th century salon. And people are standing around with an electrostatic generator, and this typically in the dark. And they would touch each other. And as they would touch each other and give off static electricity, it would actually cause the back of the retina to create the same phosphine pattern. So this has been pretty well known. This is, Franklin's early electrostatic generator. And so rather than using an electrostatic generator, a computer, and a bunch of electronics, I became really fascinated with this notion that the eyes could see without light. And is there a possibility that we could see something that wasn't just, stimulated through a function generator or through a computer? And I had spent about 2 years trying to figure this out and almost had given up when I was at an astronomy conference at MIT and saw some analog waveforms from pulsars in deep space. Now, pulsars, right, are collapsed stars. They basically fall in on themselves, and they're so dense that they begin to spin, right, around sort of an axis, and their magnetic field gives off pulses of energy, radio energy, at very sort of certain periodicities and certain sort of with certain kinds of signatures inside of the signal. Now, when I was walking, this is what it sounds like. That's the Vela pulsar, and this is the Crab Nebula that we're going to actually look at. If you look out into the southern sky tonight, at around 8 o'clock, you'll see Orion's belt. And Rigel will be sort of off to the left, and to the right is Aldebaran, which is where the Crab Nebula is. And how many of you remember Joy Division, the band Joy Division? Well, they had a famous cover on their album. And as I was walking down the hallway at MIT and I saw this album cover, it reminded me that the signal that I was looking for to stimulate the phosphenes, rather than simply looking for an electronic source to do it, was precisely pulsars. So I called friends at Haystack, which is the very large telescope that MIT owns, and I asked them if they could give me a signal that was coming from the Crab Nebula. And I built a device that basically looks like a cell phone, right? But instead of having an earphone jack that goes to earbuds, it actually puts electrodes right here on your temples and on your occiputs back here. And then we dial up these radio telescopes and we look into deep space about 150 million light years away. And lo and behold, what happens? Those signatures, the signals coming from the pulsars, actually stimulate in the mind's eye phosphenes. But the phosphenes that you receive are so extraordinary that they look like this. Now, this is a work of art that can only exist in the mind eye of the viewer. I can't pull it out. So these are computer models of what the experience is, but everyone who's experienced it at the exhibition and in the laboratory, this is very much what it's like. I'll show you a video of it. And when you multiplex stars, that means you take the Crab Nebula, you take Vela, and you sort of put them all together. You end up having something that looks very similar to this. So the idea that an artist is creating a work of art that reaches back 150 million years, wetjacks you into the universe, the brain already immediately understands this work. It doesn't need to be seen as a picture. It resides within the space of the mind's eye, that it can't be copied, it can't be shown, is sort of, emblematic of the kind of work that I'm very interested in doing. I'm going to watch our time. We've got a couple more projects I want to get through. Chimera Obscura was a telepresent, was a telerobot, and telepresent visitors were allowed to operate a massive telerobot that leaves behind digital breadcrumb trails that mathematically mutate over time as they attempt to navigate a massive maze from a human thumbprint. Now, if we put a time frame on this, it'll look a lot more interesting maybe than what it sounds right now. This is 1998 when it was commissioned by the Human Genome Project, in 2000 when it was exhibited. So 7 years before smartphones were introduced, right? And many years before we had, standard streaming codecs. So the idea that a bunch of artists would work together to create a telerobot that anyone in the world could control and actually navigate where they were going and leave behind information, genes that would evolve and change over time was pretty extraordinary. So this is what you saw in the museum, but what you saw if you were online was actually just this small section right here. And you would be able to navigate through and drag and drop files. And those files would help you sort of leave behind the breadcrumb trails, a little like Theseus and the Minotaur, to find your way through the maze. But the mathematical Minotaur that roamed through the maze would actually modify that data. So every time you went back, it was slightly different. A little like going to your hometown when you were, in your 40s. But when you were a kid, it sort of looks the same, but the hometown, some things have changed, some things have completely changed. So it's familiar, but it's completely different. 9 universities had bounties on it to try to solve it. You can see this is a snapshot of 942 visits with memes at this particular location. There are 4 layers with 64,000 locations. So nearly infinite z-axis of data was dropped inside of the Chimera. It ran for 3 years. No one ever solved it, meaning the bounties on it were less than fruitful. And so it was very much like the human genome problem, that by looking at it in small scales, the way in which, humans have the ability to sort of decipher our genome was very difficult at that time. And then having, constant mutations and various things kind of changing along the way made it a kind of a reflection or a mirror of the process. This is the interface. The right-hand side was the view that you had. This was the meme layer that you could drop. This was the ATGC layers that you could be in. In this case, C stood for cinema, graphics, text, and audio. Two more projects really quickly, and then hopefully we'll have a nice conversation. This project is called EON, and this is a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship project that used voice-modulated high-frequency ultrasound to create an improbable star in a jar. So in this project, if you kind of look to the left right here, I'm hoping that you'll see my cursor. I'm going to bring up my laser pointer again. Can everybody see the red dot? Great. So if you look at this, this is 1,000 milliliters of ultra pure water. Above and below are very high energy ultrasonic transducers, and they produce a force field in the shape of basically an hourglass or two cones that are being pointed together. And the force field inside of them, if you probably stuck your finger in there, it'd blow it off, but it would also cauterize it, right? Because it's so intense. And there are some electronics at the bottom that allow you to split apart for a brief moment, oxygen and hydrogen, allow a tiny bubble to drift up, and then I capture that bubble. And I hold that bubble sort of in suspended animation, and then I begin crushing it with sound waves very, very fast. Now, this is called sonoluminescence. There are even shrimp, rifle shrimp that produce light under water by creating a cavitation bubble. And scientists have known how to do this for 80 or 90 years, but they don't know why it actually really happens. And in this project, in EON, because of course my parents were TV producers, I understood how to use subcarriers. So you could actually produce a carrier which would produce the cavitation, but a subcarrier would allow anyone with a keyboard that could send in English, European Romance languages. You could convert your text into spoken word, and the spoken word became the force field that this tiny bubble was trapped in. And as the tiny bubble is trapped, we actually begin to crush it at near relativistic speeds. And so far the theory is that the cavitation bubble gets out of phase. The air and the water interface get out of phase with one another. They shift places and light comes out. Now, this light is very unusual. Normally, you would have absorption or emission lines if you looked at a light source through a photospectrometer. But this light looks very much like a black body. So that means that the light inside of this vessel does not really look like it comes from where it is. So here's a high-speed video, about 50,000 frames a second. It's very choppy because of zoom, of the radius of the bubble collapsing, reforming, collapsing, reforming. And if I walked back a slide, you'll see these stereo microscopes actually record all of this in 3D. And the museum visitors actually step into this star in 3 dimensions wearing stereoscopic glasses. And there are electronics that down convert the electricity or the light coming out of the tiny sonoluminescent bubble and converts it back from light to electricity and electricity to sound, so you can hear your voice or your text being spoken through a synthesizer as voice coming outside of the light. We've got one more project, and I think we're right on time. This one's called Magniforma. It's the project that I'm working on right now. It uses a large-scale industrial modified ABB robotic arm with a custom tool path attachment called a planchette. And the project is designed to actually physically construct the entire surface topography of Mars, 144 million square kilometers, 1 kilometer at a time. It'll be the largest project ever made by any humans ever, 7 million times larger than the Great Wall. So the terrain data acquisition actually comes from multiple sources. HiRISE, which is a high-resolution science experiment that's done by NASA, and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiters. We have good radar data. We have good stereo image data. We have good photogrammetry data. And basically what we'll do is the digital terrain data is used to create a contiguous planetary surface grid with a spatial resolution of 1 kilometer, using all of the orbiter information that we have. And that terrain model data will power choreographic-like movement of magniformis planchette as it sort of fluidly emulates the surface topography of the planet. You can almost think of this as a magic carpet, right? That's going over every square inch of the surface of the planet, constructing it. Something that's really kind of cool to think about is as the planchette renders each individual square kilometer of terrain, it only does so for 1 second. So I'm not being wasteful here, right? We're not going to build all of Mars. We're going to build one section at a time, erase it, another section at a time, erase it 1 kilometer at a time. But what's amazing is by doing 1 kilometer per second, it actually reaches an incredible apparent land speed of Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound on the surface of Mars during a 4.5-year render cycle. There's parametric design environment, which allows us all kinds of early sort of control and modeling to be able to assemble everything that's necessary to render the surface of an entire planet at that resolution. It's designed to operate in museums and public spaces, and it will be really one of the largest visualization systems in the world. However, because of its physical size and sort of conceptual scale, it challenges basic logic. Let's think about it for a minute. Mars is real, right? We all know that. There are people who work there every single day. They put on gloves, they put on, goggles, they go and they move rovers around. But it's so far away that it almost becomes imaginary, right? Each one of you has genes encoding proteins in your body right now, but we're not thinking about that. But the idea that, I didn't want to make pictures or objects that sort of referred to things. I wanted to make those things themselves. Trying to achieve something at this scale became very interesting sort of conceptual problem. And so you can kind of think of it that while it's incomprehensible in scale, it's also ephemeral, right? Like a performance where the whole can never really truly be touched, held, or inhabited. So here's a video, very good model of it. It's very stuttery because of zoom. If you notice the color change, there's a photogrammetry. Imagine that if we took a picture of the sky at the horizon at Mars, and it included the lower part of the surface. As you move across the surface, the sky changes and the ground changes. And so the planchette here actually, as it moves and shapes the surface topology, has a photogrammetry gradient that's spread across as light that's telling you the lower edge, right, is at the planet's surface, and now it's swooping up over into the sky, it's coming down, it's going into a valley, it's very low, and as it pitches back up, you basically have sort of a visual representation that's quantitatively very accurate of the surface of the planet. So as a research hybrid project, it represents this kind of quintessential pairing or synthesis of diverse fields that are sort of at the edge of art, design, science, engineering thinking. To be able to create it, you can almost think of it from a lot of different directions. One of the slides that I have up here says that it also could be thought of as a motion picture, but on a cosmological scale. If you think of the squares, right, like as each frame in a movie. But it's a story that's born in three-dimensional space rather than of a narrative fiction. And the research discoveries that are realized in the creation of the project will support innovative forms of collaboration, generate new technical knowledge, emerging applications that can be exported and mobilized for the public good. Robots are becoming more collaborative and safer for us to interact with, but for us to be able to increase their utilization, all kinds of changes must occur for us to be able to bring them to new markets and creative horizons. It's a natural collaborative research environment for augmented and mixed reality. ABB's robotic studio allows all of us in different locations on the planet to be able to be in the same room while we're operating the robot and coding it. And it will also allow us to develop new experiences like AR, VR, MR, mixed reality experiences for new art audiences. There's exponential growth for a lot of other fields as well, especially in the arts. But not everybody's going to be a computer scientist and a programmer. So we've got to figure out things around timing, animation control, all of these which are not currently well served by sort of the industrial tool and manufacturing paradigms. So one of the unique focuses of a project like this is to actually help simplify the robotic programming so it's rapidly reconfigurable and usable by a bunch of different people, and especially with inside of creative industries. We want to make it as easy to manipulate as players in a video game setting. So ABB's just shipping in. Their first robot is just leaving the warehouse literally today. Today's Thursday. It actually left the warehouse yesterday, Wednesday, and we'll be in Richmond. So we're well on our way to sort of, this, hybrid engineering arts project. I'm lucky to have a really wonderful research collaborator, David Shepard, who's an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science here at VCU. And he's worked all over and also was a principal scientist at ABB. And we've got graduate students, undergraduates working with us on this project as well. I'm watching our time. I want to be sensitive. I want to thank all of you for sharing breakfast with me, breaking bread, letting me share a little bit about what it is that I do at the intersection of art, science, and engineering. And I would be delighted to stop my screen share, enjoy some faces again, and entertain any questions that Peter and all of you wish to have me entertain. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you very much, Shawn. I appreciate it. I'm going to change the schedule a little bit. I want to give just one quick comment here on what's coming next, and then we'll go to the questions, and that way people can stay as long as they want instead of having to stop it and to do that. Just wanted to tell you that our next meeting is March 22nd. It'll be on Zoom again. It's the last one, hopefully on Zoom. Our speaker will be Robin Farzad. He was born in Iran, raised in Miami, graduated from Princeton and Harvard, went on to Goldman Sachs, then worked on business, became a journalist and worked on business shows in New York, Washington, Africa, and the Middle East. And I know he's in demand because I was composing a text to him the other day, and he answered very quickly and said, "I can't talk right now." I said, "Okay." And I happened to look up at the TV. He was being introduced on a TV show to talk about Ukraine and the economics of what's happening in Ukraine. But the really interesting thing is, after all that travel, he's come to Richmond to live here the rest of his life, he thinks. And he's going to tell us, he's very active in the community now, and he's going to tell us why he thinks Richmond is the future of the city of the future, and why he thinks it has such a great future. So it'll be Robin Farzad on March 22nd. We'll get an email out to you soon. And with that, Peter, I'll turn it over to you. I don't need to list any of the questions because I understood 100% of everything. I'm sure everybody else did too. So, but maybe some people have a few questions. Peter?
Yeah, thank you. That was that was a lot to take in, but it was fascinating. Every bit of it was fascinating. So thank you very much. My first question for you is, my family, my ancestry is filled with scientists, artists, and actually priests in my case. And my discovery of these traits in me have been more, if I were an MLB player, I would be really high in the standings, at least 300 or better. But how do we sort of discover these things earlier in children, and then what do we do about it? I mean, in a way, the Da Vinci program at VCU is one at a college, but how do we, drive that back into even younger and, younger children, so that they don't have to do the things that I did to find out that I have all this going on.
Yeah. So it's a great question, Peter. Let me kind of put my arms around all of it for everyone. I'll just give you a couple of data points. So 61% of VCU's high SAT scores on the Monroe campus are in the art school. Stop and think about that. That includes engineering, everybody. It includes science, all of that. So what you're having is artists are smart, right? That's not what I'm saying, though. I'm saying that smart kids are choosing the art school because they want to be part of the culture of innovation, right? And they don't know where else to fit it in. How do you do dance and astrobiology? Because they see a pathway for this to make sense, Peter, right? That's what you're saying. I don't want to, trash any of the private schools around here, but my son goes to a private school. And the first private school that he went to, I asked him at the end of his first year, I said, how did you like it? And he goes, I loved it. And he talked about all of these exciting things. And I said, well, what would you do to make the absolutely best experience, the best school day that you could ever have? I said, what would you do different? And he goes, well, first I'd wiggle, and then I would do science, then I'd wiggle, and I'd do art, and I'd wiggle, and I'd do math, and I'd wiggle, and I'd do music, and I'd wiggle, and I'd do sports. And I was like, I love this. Tell me about this wiggle thing, right? This is all new to me. And he goes, Dad, you know what wiggling is? And all of a sudden it dawned on me, and I said, well, do they let you wiggle where you currently go to school? And he's like, and he put his head down, and he said, no, they don't let me wiggle. And so we interviewed at other schools on the day that we happened to be at this particular school. They had a bunch of, 7-year-olds in lab coats making, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches with a robot. It was a disaster. There was peanut butter everywhere and jelly everywhere, but they were, doing object-oriented programming. They were putting it all together. And he's like, Dad, I have to go to school at that school. And so to Peter's point, right, we are witnessing something that's happening. I'll tell, parents all the time, your kids don't need to go to university to be artists. But if they're going to go to university to be artists, they need to make only work that's possible at universities. And the other thing I mentioned the other night is that you don't want to send your child to university where anything's possible. And that sounds completely counterintuitive. You think that that's the perfect place. You actually want to send your child to a school where it's likely, not possible. Possible means you got to bash your head against the wall and bend the university to your will to get there. And that's sort of the old school model of like, well, you earned your way, you opened the door, you bent things, and you kind of got where you wanted to go. But, the way in which things are coming at us, the problems are coming at us, the speed in which humans are going to have to solve these issues that are right in front of us, you want to be in a place where it's primed for success, right? So finding catalysts that are early on, both whether it's your parents or schools, and then, preparing for and laddering up to institutions where, our children are going to go for higher education, where anything's not just possible, but where it's likely, Peter.
That's a great thought. Likely is great. I think Mighty Casey has a question.
Yeah, I'm like looking over here. I'm seeing, questions on entropy and you name it. This is all very good. So just keep
Peter kind of asked my question, but I want to, focus it specifically because you're an education guy in and amongst all the other things that you've demonstrably mastered here. But what's your thinking? What's the over under on whether or not we're going to be able for public education? Because you said you're sending your kid to a private school, and good for you. I mean, he's getting what he needs, but making K through 12 for everybody, possibly, or not possibly, likely an interdisciplinary approach as opposed to this training good factory workers model that we're still stuck in from the late 19th, early 20th century. What do you think the chances are there? How long will it take? Will it happen?
It will happen, but the future's here. It's just unevenly distributed. So I was dean in Canada for 5 years, and they operate quite differently there. I remember taking my students, university students, to interview with corporations who are looking for employees. And they sort of looped back to me, and we had lunch after. I brought about 15 or 20 of some of the brightest students that I had, and they said it was a really awkward conversation. No one was interested, and they didn't seem to care about what we were doing. And they asked me if I could give them insight, and I said yes. We had trained them not to be employees; we trained them to be employers, right? That they're looking at you as competition. They're actually sizing you up as to whether or not they want to step out and do it on their own, right? Versus actually sort of folding in and working their way up the ladder. So I know that there is a socioeconomic, barrier to private schools. I didn't bandy it about my son. A lot of kids have ADHD. There's all kinds of things that they need sort of, special attention and approaches, and private schools have a tendency to just provide that.
And boys need to wiggle.
Boys need to wiggle. Girls do too. But for the, public schools, we see everything from censorship to you name it starting to sort of, happen. And we have to be really clear about what it is that we want to accomplish. And with our, our children, I would just simply say when I was in school, I was born, in the Midwest, and I had art K through 12 every single day. I had AP art and I had AP science. I think there was such a fear in the Midwest of being culturally bankrupt, not because it was not New York or LA, that they really just loaded it on everyone. You couldn't get away from it, right? And so the idea that that our persistence numbers, the students staying in high, through K through 12, increases when they have access to the arts. We have the actual numbers. When I was in Canada, they quantify everything. And one of our donors gave $5 million to create programs that would be after-school programs that weren't being funded by the provinces anymore, the equivalent of the states or of the government. And we actually had data that showed that the students persisted better. But one of the interesting things, Casey, was that when we opened up a lot of these courses, they didn't fill up the way that they used to, like a piano course, right? But the minute we changed the name of the piano course to something like codes and beats, which is the same thing as piano, we were teaching piano, then they would fill up. So we had to be able to reorient to the mind of where these young children are, what they're seeing, what they're exposed to, but at the same time, being able to adapt and be able to create, sort of an attraction and a draw, and continually open the doors for them. So there are models out there that exist. Whether or not we can achieve it uniformly across the United States is questionable, but we have very reasonable school districts here, Henrico and Richmond, who are ripe for certain kinds of, I would say, evolutions and experiments. And I think sometimes having universities reach back down into and providing opportunities may be the way to go. I'm sorry I don't have a clear, a precise pin that I can put on it. I've got some ideas, and they reach out to me to consult. But whether or not we've got the will to do it sort of, ends up being a problem. I know we're a little over time, but I've set the morning aside. So if anybody has other questions, the entropy question was interesting. There were other ones, Peter.
Yeah, there was one artist and business owner, Bart Levy, had a question. Bart, let's see. Maybe.
When you were talking about ice being from, I forget exactly the terms, but I was wondering when you were talking about ice, could you, I was thinking, would that be a way to repopulate glaciers and icebergs and these ancient freshwater sources that are disappearing now?
Reconstitute them into icebergs? Is that what you're kind of saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful imaginative solution, and it's not something that's not fallen on deaf ears. So let me just let me wind it up this way. There's nothing more hubristic than one of your silver-haired colleagues standing in front of you saying, "I just cloned a glacier." The thing that's only more hubristic than that is that we have to have a conversation on why someone would have to do that, to point out the fact that the environment is really challenged, right? And so in the laboratory, for example, you could theoretically build a nucleating material that triggered the phase change from water at a slightly warmer temperature. And you could do it in a way that would cause freezing to occur at 2 degrees Celsius or 34 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 32, right? There's all kinds of interventional strategies. However, the laws of unintended consequence, right? by ever so slightly shifting those tiny incremental changes as we're seeing in terms of, sea level height, warming, cleaving of, large segments, off of Greenland and Antarctica. I mean, there's a lot going on. So the interventional stuff is always an option, but it has unintended consequences. There were moments, and I don't have this sort of mindset, but if I was really totally bonkers, I could in the lab, probably with a group of people, invent a nuclei that not only would, freeze or help water go through a phase change warmer, but I could make it in my own image so that all snowflakes and ice and anything that would precipitate down henceforward would be my work of art, right? And so you have to think about the utility and you have to think about the moral and the ethical. And you have to, and I think that there had always been a great deal of anxiety when I was dean that we were instrumentalizing the art school, and that's not true. We have so many problems and so many of the artists that want to engage, right, with others in sort of problem solving. And it's not turning it into a factory that is a problem solving factory because we just can't make better choices, to Casey's point, of building better schools, than just, dump it on engineers and artists to kind of constantly solve. But there is an untapped potential there that's so extraordinary that if it was applied and directed, that we have a wealth of opportunity that I don't think anyone really fully realizes. And it's not just our art schools, it's art schools around the world. In fact, Ridley Scott, if you all remember Blade Runner, right? He gave $75 million to the Royal School in London to change it from a art school to a STEM to STEAM school, art, science, or science, technology, engineering, art, design, and math. So it's an entirely different animal now. And you can see sort of where some of these things are headed. And you can see it's not just from, people, my age trying to get my ideas forward. It's coming from students who are attempting to do something that we can't do.
Yeah. Well, it seems like in this scenario, the alternative is to take one of the ice comets, capture it out of orbit, and then bring it and land it here. Maybe Elon Musk could do that. Well,
Peter, the last point to Bart's.
It still masks the issue with the environment, though.
Yeah. If you take it to the granular level, if we can make snowflakes in laboratories and snowflakes are nothing more than stories, then there's nothing that stops us from putting computer data inside of the dendrites, right? And when we head into deep space, almost all the technology will fail simply because of gamma radiation, thermal expansion and contraction. It just won't work. Comets last for a very long time. And if we built ice structures that actually had sort of a programmable data inside of the dendrites, inside of their structures, you could use that in many ways to sort of reprogram, reboot, restart sort of scripts that would begin to, emulate in the real world rather than just sort of as computer programming language, whether that's another planet or in deep space. It seems highly theoretical, but those are the ways you have to look at it.
Yeah.
I'm aware of our time. It's 10 after.
Okay. Do you have one more? Bill, I believe, WC Consulting from Maryland. Is that?
Yeah, that's me.
Okay. You had quite a few questions. You want to select one and see?
I like entropy, Bill.
Okay.
You like that? Yeah, it's like I'm sitting here just nodding my head through your whole presentation. So it was very cool.
So let's take the sunluminescence, the EON project.
Yeah.
So entropy definitely leaks in there. The higher the energy, right, that's placed inside of the cavitation environment, it starts to warm up. And the resonant frequency of the vessel begins to drift, right? It starts to change. Entropy sets in. And so for better or for worse, I don't want to say that, unfairly, I fight against entropy and I use tools to do that. I can't fight it off eternally, but in this particular project, there are sensors that actually measure, right, the resonant frequency of the vessel, the temperature change, and the drift characteristics of the bubble, and are constantly adjusting to keep it in the center, to keep it sort of, ongoing. And if it gets out of control, there's a bootstrap that will actually re-kickstart it so that it stays stable. But usually in a laboratory, we do one literally tiny flash of light, use a streak camera, do a bunch of measurements, and that's it. But to do it 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, you've got to have other things in there that are fighting against entropy. And so some of the technology is used to, beat it back. But we won't win out. But for the moment that the projects are running, there are tools that help sort of, augment the resiliency of works like this against entropy, even though it is embedded in it.
So you're not letting chaos theory run wild within your experiments. You're actually establishing a control. You're actually establishing a control volume around what you're doing to keep the energy balance constant within it.
Yeah, and if you go back to the one where I was levitating the particles, do you remember seeing bright red lines?
Yeah.
Those are very, very, very powerful lasers. And when you have an eccentric particle that will actually have an eccentric orbit that will come through and blow apart one of these little galaxies, they're meant to trap those. That's the sort of the no-go zone, right? So if you get outside of, the normal sort of structure or pattern, you're captured and you're caught inside of a very powerful optical trap, and you won't escape. So yeah, there's a lot of, I'll just say, guidance when you're building the systems. But on a cosmological scale, it would happen over hundreds of millions of years. And so those irregularities get absorbed, or we observe them slowly. But when we're doing them in very short periods, you have to sort of regulate that.
So you haven't done any extension out into the plasma realm yet. You're still staying down in optical. Primarily,
yeah. There's a lot of work. There's new holographic projects that are using small, tiny plasma dots, and they're organizing sort of plasma pixels in space. But in this particular, sort of range of projects, and especially to get them into museums, you have to stay reasonably safe. And depending on how you define plasma and in terms of the volume that it's in and how secure and safe it is. This is sort of the range that I've been excited to work in.
Well, thank you for your answers, and you're just having way too much fun. I'm very envious.
All right, I'm going to exercise my host privilege here and ask the last question. Did you really meet Elvis Presley when you were little?
Absolutely. Lived next door to the Cashes. And because if you remember, radio stations were the parent stations to TV stations. TV stations were literally like somebody's bedroom, and until they grew up and got really big. I got to sit in the Batmobile, do all of that, and we got all, Chad and Jeremy, got to hang out with them because the radio was the real driver. And Ryman Auditorium was pretty fun in those days, but when you're that young, you don't really, and my parents didn't come from a country western background. They just needed people who had live continuity and live performance. And my dad fought on the USS Missouri Task Force in the Navy, and my mom was in OSS OSI, sort of Secret Service, CIA, and they had a lot of skill, right, at manning live events, knowing how to manage and to create those kinds of experiences, but had plenty of opportunity, to be around lots of celebrities.
Great. All right. Thank you again, Shawn. We really appreciate it. Thank you all for staying. Questions were great, and we will see you on March 22nd.
Thanks everybody. Have a wonderful spring, and I will hopefully see you at another Encorepreneur moment.
It sounds good.
Thanks.
Hey, cheers. Bye. Thank you. Blessings to everybody.